Um, the theme of this afternoon's talk is mind power, case closed. Um, I think those of you who know me and who heard me at the previous conference or who are familiar with my work are aware that I'm very interested in combining the testimony of seekers with personal experience with advances in contemporary science. And I think we've seen so much over the past, say, 150 years or so in terms of advances in psychology, mind body medicine, uh, in more contemporary terms, neuroplasticity, placebo research, psychical research, the academic study of um, extraphysical abilities, the academic statistical tracking of anomalous transfer of information in laboratory settings, what might be considered ESP or telepathy or precognition in certain cases, um, as well as just extraordinary advances in our understanding of popular mechanics and particle mechanics and the way in which objects on subatomic particles really appear and become actualized, localized, measurable only based on the participation and the perspective of an observer. We've seen enough so that it's incontrovertible at this point in the 21st century to conclude that the mind is not only possessed of extra local characteristics, the mind not only evinces a measurable, consistent effect over physicality, whether it's in the gray matter of the brain as measured through brain scans, through neuroplasticity, or whether it's through placebo advances such as placebo surgeries, which have now been tracked as being effective entering the 21st century. Um, but the mind on an actual subatomic scale, uh, apropos of what we've come to understand in quantum mechanics, takes measurements, and in so doing, in taking measurements using the instrumentation of the quantum mechanics research lab, determines what will actually appear, what will actually show up, not in potentiality, but in actuality. In other words, to reduce uh, quantum theory to a kind of very brief keynote, uh, subatomic particles themselves exist in a wave state or a state of superposition or infinitude. Interference patterns demonstrate that subatomic particles show up literally everywhere at once and become only localized, only measurable, only actual when an individual sentient observer takes a measurement. Not only does this demonstrate to us that, at least on the micro scale, um, the decision of the individual to take a measurement creates what's actually there, what's actually actual, what's actually local. But more so than that, we're faced with the prospect of infinite possibilities being existent based upon the presence of an observer, the absence of an observer, whether or not an observer chooses to take a measurement at, you know, 2 o'clock in the afternoon Eastern Time or 2:01 in the afternoon Eastern Time. It changes everything in terms of what's actualized within our world, but the potentiality of what's going on in other dimensions, other possibilities, other actualities is also existent. Everything exists as a potential, but for the observer to take a measurement and thus actually experience what is there in his or her own life. So I'm sort of marching through this material very quickly, but the fact is, a big question that I have for myself as a seeker and for all of us is what what are our five senses? Taste, touch, hearing, sight, sound. What what are our powers of cognition other than organic technologies, instruments for taking measurements? And is it possible that we are doing this all the time and that we are experiencing things always and everywhere based upon perception, expectation, emotionalized thought. And if that's the case, then it also raises the question that whatever you or I are experiencing is something that we are experiencing within a kind of universe composed of our own perceptions. And the person seated next to you, the person whose face is appearing on the Zoom screen right now as I'm speaking, he or she is also experiencing life according to perception. And it begs the question of whether or not, in fact, all of us are kind of crisscrossing throughout these multi-dimensional realities, occasionally encountering one another as individual psyches, as individual centers of consciousness, which are real, which are actual, which are sentient, but there's infinite numbers of them. There's infinite numbers of them. So the Mitch that you're experiencing right now is one of me. You know, there's a psychical center. There's a psyche called Mitch, or there's a psyche seated in the audience called Jerry or called Martha or what have you. And that's an actual being, but you are having your own experience of that actual being. And that person is crisscrossing throughout your reality and throughout the realities of other people who are seated in this room, other people around the world. And there exists an infinitude of possibilities at any moment. And it stands to reason that there must. We experience time as kind of a linear rational march, for example, and yet we know that linear time itself is an illusion. It's a necessary illusion that helps us get through life. This insight goes back to Einstein's theories of time and relativity, in which he theorized, and experiments have since demonstrated, that in fact time does slow down in environments of extreme gravity or extreme speed. Even people who have been involved in space travel, which is nowhere near light speed, have evinced the effects, however moderately, of time slowing down for them as a physical actuality based on accelerated speeds. We know that time slows down in environments of extreme gravity, like a black hole, for example. So the thing that we call time itself is an actual bendable thing. It's something that we experience interpreted through our senses so that we're able to get things done. We have these infinite possibilities, and yet they don't announce themselves, every instant of our lives. Our lives in this outer macro world that we live in do not reveal themselves in any apparent way as presenting infinite possibilities to us. We experience singular events. We experience singular versions of one another. We experience a rational march of time. It's only when we begin to look at the actualities of life, either by measuring things with finer and finer instruments, or by experimenting as to whether there are possibilities of the mind passing information back and forth in ways that go beyond the ordinary five senses, or by understanding that time is actually extralinear. At such moments, we catch glimpses of the infinitude of the human psyche. But of course, I'm speaking in terms of the sciences. There are other instances where people have what might be referred to as mystical experiences, where they individually experience a sense of infinitude, experience a collapse of time, experience a collapse of distinction between themselves and their neighbor, experience a sense of human wholeness, experience a continuum between thought and event. You've had those experiences. Many of you are seated in this room precisely because you've had those experiences and you've come to an individual sense of truth about them. William James, the great American philosopher who's a hero to me, used to say that the mystic, and he said this in 1902, before the advent of any of the sciences to which I've been making reference, James said that the mystic sees things as though he or she is viewing them under a microscope. He or she sees more and more of what's really going on, what's really happening. So if I look at a drop of water, for example, what do I see? Well, it's viscous, it's what I call wet, it's clear. I don't see very much else that's going on. But if you put that same drop of water under a powerful microscope, suddenly you might see bacteria and single-celled organisms and molecules that can be split into atoms and things constantly in a state of movement. And then when you pan back using coarser and coarser instrumentation, you see less and less of what's actually happening, which is the state that we are often in. And quantum physicists have asked the question of why we see things happening on a surreal level in a particle lab that we don't see happening on Thursday afternoon, during whatever activity we're in. And they refer to this phenomenon as information leakage. Again, as they were saying the same thing that James was saying without necessarily realizing that he had made that same point instinctively or experientially over a century ago. That again, if we view life through coarser and coarser sensory equipment, we see less and less of what's happening. So for James, the mystic is very sensitive. So he or she sees more of reality. He or she sees things through cleansed doors of perception. And for quantum theorists who are dealing with the quantum measurement problem, asking why there's this difference between what goes on the subatomic scale and what you and I experience in the above ground macro scale, they're saying, well, there's this information leakage that goes on because we're measuring things in a coarser and coarser way. And this probably accounts for the fact that our spiritual commitments are borne out at certain moments. Sometimes we experience this wonderful affirmation between what might be called the dreaming and the coming true. And other times, as it's sometimes put, as T.S. Eliot put it, between the dreaming and the coming true falls the shadow. And so we don't really feel at all times the sense of connectivity, the sense of possibility. We feel a sense that we're alienated from our own higher selves. In a way, that's a kind of spiritual leakage, if I can put it in those terms, that we experience. Hence, the laws and the forces of extra physicality, which I think have been affirmed by the individual seeker, and which I think have been affirmed by science, where there's a kind of harmony there. Those laws and forces they're clearly not always experienced. Disruptors occur. These things bend based on circumstance. Not only the circumstance of thought and expectation, but possibly other circumstances that we have to live under that we only capture in glimpses. My contention is that even if awareness or reality, consciousness is the ultimate arbiter of existence, we still experience many, many different laws and forces within the physical framework that we occupy. I used to say we live under many different laws and forces. I'm not sure if that's entirely right, but we experience many different laws and forces. And these experiences are very hard-baked into us. So it stands to reason that even if emotive thought, perspective, awareness, even if these things are determinative of what reality gets concretized into our individual experiences. There are different laws and possibilities that are also playing out at the same time. There are physical facts under which also form part of the nature of our experience within this framework that we find ourselves. And it could be that there are other frameworks in which our psyches are much freer. It could be that there are other frameworks in which we experience fewer laws and forces that seem to interrupt a sense of continuousness between you, the individual, you, the seeker, and that which you experience. Within string theory, a term that's commonly heard nowadays, there exists a kind of theorized model of reality in which all of life, all that is, exists on these kinds of vibrating strings. And every particle, every universe, everything that's experienced is connected through these kinds of vibrating strings, so that all the potential realities that I've been talking about exist, but they exist perhaps out of sight or out of experience from the individual. The individual experiences usually one reality going on at a time, but there are these different realities and possibilities along these so-called vibrating strings within string theory. At least that's one iteration of it. And it's possible, one of the things I've theorized, and this is just a thought, but we're living through this moment in the 21st century where there's just the most concrete evidence that a person could possibly ask for with respect to UFO phenomena. For example, we have evidence on high definition video from Navy fighter pilot cockpits. We have evidence on radar. We have the Pentagon releasing a report marching through almost 150 cases saying, well, these are the things that we've documented and experimented, we've documented and made inquiries over, and we're experiencing forms of technology that are not explicable by any worldly understanding that we possess. So we have just absolute confirmation of the existence of UFOs as a question that go outside of any of the ordinary categories that we may have grown up with. When I was a kid, if you talked about UFOs, somebody would always say, oh, swamp gas, weather balloon, illusion, imagination, little green men, blah, blah, blah. Those dismissals seem like they belong to yesterday. No serious person nowadays would dispute the validity of the UFO thesis. And one of the things that's occurred to me is this, it's actually possible, given the theoretical models that we have, that it may be easier to explain the UFO thesis by interdimensionality than it would by figuring out ways that such vast distances in our galaxy or our universe could be spanned by physical craft. It's a greater theoretical problem to try to figure out how a physical craft could travel such vast, vast distances than it is to rely upon the quantum mechanical and string theory model and ask the question, gee, is it possible that from time to time we here occupying this dimension that we more or less consensually agree upon experience stuff that's going on in other dimensions? And then we give it names like extraterrestrial or Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster or what have you, or ghosts or poltergeists, We have these testimonies that go back, since time immemorial, that are remarkably and tantalizingly consistent. And now, lo and behold, in 2021, we have these theoretical models which seriously talk about the possibility, maybe even the necessity, of the existence of other dimensions. We have data, which I've been reviewing in brief, for the extra-physical and the causal factors of the mind. We have these accounts of so-called UFOs that are more vivid and more validated now than any time in human history. And it could be that we right now, in 2021, are getting better glimpses of what it means to be multidimensional beings, of what it means for the psyche possibly to be multidimensional, infinite, than we've understood as a human species at any time in the past. And there's a long way to go. There's a long way to go until those doors of perception are cleansed, if I'm on the right trail. I don't know that I am, but it falls to every generation to at least try to understand what's around the next corner. So if I'm on the right trail, it could be that our generation is experiencing an opening that will ultimately result in a redefinition of human nature, at least as much as the advent of Darwin's theory of evolution resulted in a redefinition of human nature in the Victorian era. And we may be just at the beginning, just at the infancy of starting to understand ourselves as these multidimensional beings, as beings possessed of psyches that are infinite. And it's difficult, because, of course, one of the things, that we have to contend with as well is the absolute reality of physical decline and demise. These bodies that we're in are going to decay. We're going to experience, every one of us, decline and demise as traditionally understood, in our world. And yet, the very opening to the possibility of physical non-locality does begin to leaven even that question, the question of the ultimate nature of death. And of course, seekers have been probing the question of the psychical survival of death for millennia. So this is nothing new. But what's new is that I think we're seeing a convergence of understandings, a convergence of conversations, a convergence of possibilities. And it's strange, because we live in a world that politically and culturally is so divided, and yet at the same time, we are starting to see a convergence between the probings and the experiments going on within the theoretical and hard sciences, and the probings and the experiments going on among everyday seekers. I mean, for all the fraying in our world, there's no question that those conversations are starting to come together. The question for us as seekers is, what do we do with this information? What do we do with it? I have found, and I'm interested to hear from some of you, in terms of your perceptions and your experiences. And I'm going to leave time, of course, so that we have some time for exchange at the end of my talk. But I have found that in my own personal spiritual search, say going back the last 20, 25 years, I'm 55 today, and I would say going back maybe to my early 30s, I began to find that, and this has been progressively true as time has passed, and I'm very interested to hear from some of you all what your experience has been. I find that I personally have gotten less and less interested in ceremony and liturgy and ritual. My practice has gotten, if anything, more informal, more self-created, more self-devised. Um, I've gone through periods where I've been very, very intensively dedicated to one point of view or one religious expression or another, and I've really dug a very, very, very deep well. And I've been very dedicated to certain traditional practices and ideas. I've been very dedicated to certain esoteric practices and ideas. But I find that nowadays, I'm really very, very free flowing. And I tend to be very loose and open in my practice. So my practice might include meditation, my practice might include prayer, my practice includes intention setting, visualization. I mean, I think one of the reasons I'm so drawn to New Thought is New Thought has always had a free-flowing quality to it, although, for some of us that includes a congregational approach, for others, not so. For me, things are very, very free-flowing. And I've come to wonder, I've come to wonder whether spiritual practice, whether religion, as we define it, I mean, isn't all of this stuff, isn't all of religion, isn't all of science, isn't it all designed to help us see reality? Isn't that really what it's all about? We're trying to experience more and more of what's actual, of what's going on. The researcher experiences that in his or her own realm. The seeker experiences that. Sometimes the researcher and the seeker are one and the same. We're trying to probe reality, and we're trying to be full and complete beings within that reality. And so, if we begin to get a sense of ourselves as we actually are, if we begin to cleanse those doors of perception and see more and more of what's going on, one question that I have is, does formal religion or formal spiritual practice then sort of start to recede into the distance? Does it become less and less necessary? One of my heroes, Neville Goddard, who I have tattooed here, used to teach, beautiful man, and the greatest influence on my life of any individual teacher, would teach that, you have to enter into the feeling state of the wish fulfilled in order to enact the creative or causative powers of your mind. And I honor that. And yet, I also realize that when a person is experiencing grief or depression or anxiety or addiction, it is very difficult for that individual to enact the feeling state of something else, something better, something more productive. That feeling state when you're in anguish, when I'm in anguish, can seem very, very distant and very, very far away. So, what is the individual to do? Is that some kind of cruel trick that Mother Nature plays on us where, wow, I'm suffering, I'm racked with anxiety or depression or what have you, but in order to find my way to a better actuality, I need to adopt this feeling state, and it's very difficult sometimes for the individual to adopt that feeling state, especially when he or she is in the most acute state of need. So, one of the things I've asked myself recently is that if the individual realizes his or her own infinitude, is that enough? Is that enough? So that maybe even the visualization, the affirmation, the adoption of feeling state, effective though those things are, maybe the individual doesn't even need those techniques. Maybe those techniques themselves are a kind of a way, in which we access things, in which we translate actuality into experience, in which we see things more clearly. But maybe if the individual begins to realize his or her own potential and possibility, maybe even those things are not requirements, are not necessary. Maybe just realizing that your mind has causative powers, maybe the wish itself, the mental direction itself, that by itself, becomes sufficient. Maybe everything becomes simpler and simpler. But of course, even as I say this, I must hasten to add something that I alluded to earlier, which is that we still live within a physical framework where we experience certain laws and limitations. And how that changes, if that changes, based on the awareness that I'm talking about, that's a big question. That's a big question that faces perhaps not just our, but future generations. If practice, if what I'm saying is right, or at least if I'm moving in the right direction, if practice, these are just questions, if practice becomes simpler, if life in a certain sense becomes simpler, then is it also the case that the range of circumstances that we experience, the multiple laws and forces under which we live, maybe we experience the peeling back of some of those, or they seem more permeable, or they seem less absolute. It could be that this generation is beginning, just beginning to experience some of that. I don't know. But these are the questions that I'm occupied by as a seeker. I'm writing a new book, which is coming out next year, called Daydream Believer, where I begin to ask some of these questions about whether our powers are becoming more and more accessible to us. It's funny. This is a bit of a tangent, but it's important. In 2010, as some of you are aware, there was a very innovative placebo experiment at Harvard Medical School called the transparent placebo. And in short, the transparent placebo took a collection of sufferers of irritable bowel syndrome and divided some folk into a control group and some folk into an active experimental group. And the folk in the active experimental group were given an honest placebo, a transparent placebo. They were told, we're giving you a treatment, but it's an inert treatment. It has no active pharmacological quality whatsoever. And remarkably enough, 59% of the people in the active group reported sustained and lasting relief, as opposed to 35% in the control group. And that was a significant statistical difference. And, I thought to myself, that's fascinating that, we could enact the placebo response without benevolent deception, because the placebo effect is based on your thinking that you got some active substance or some active treatment, and that seems to engender hopeful energies or hopeful expectation that trigger recovery in a significant number of cases. And in this case, the researchers were able to trigger that response on a significant scale without a decoy drug, just telling people, hey, we're just giving you an inert substance, we're being completely transparent with you. So dig that, dig that. I mean, that's kind of an example of what I'm talking about, where those study participants, a significant number of them, were able to experience sustained and lasting belief without a trick, without a technique, without a method. They were just told you're being given an inert substance, but the very belief that hopeful expectancy, call it that, was sufficient, was enough to generate the outcome. Dig that. Dig that. So that's what I'm trying to drive at. If you understand, if I understand that our minds have these extra physical abilities, even though we're not always able to experience it, even though there's a lot of stuff going on within the physical framework, is that understanding enough to make you a more infinite being, by which I mean, in many respects, a simpler being, you know. Suddenly, maybe, we don't need as much stuff, to trigger experience. Maybe liturgy, prayer, etc., all of which I grew up with. I grew up in a traditional Jewish household in New York City. I had an Orthodox bar mitzvah. So believe me, you know, I've been down the road of liturgy, But I'm just asking the question of whether things get simpler and simpler and simpler as we realize more and more of who we are. And then comes the question, if this is in the direction of truth, if I've got hold of something real, okay, then what do we do with this power? What do we do with it? There's an ethical dimension to that. And it's a tough one. It's a tough one because I think we in the New Thought world, I think sometimes we experience, how can I put it? I think sometimes we experience a question of purpose, maybe even a crisis of purpose, I mean, are we kind of, in it for ourselves? Are we in it for our community? Are we in it for the world? Is there any division between any of that? These are tough questions. These are tough questions. We all want to say like, well, sure, I want to receive positive things in my life in order that I can share them, in order that I can provide for another person, in order that I can improve or increase the productivity of the world, and I honor that, of course. But, it seems to me that one of the ignition points of mental experience is absolute sincerity. We have to know, who am I really? What do I really want? We can become very alienated from ourselves and not know, what we really want. We can become overly accustomed to telling ourselves, well, I know what I want. It's simple. It's this, it's that. And, I was asked, this is Halloween, so, somebody asked me, what's my favorite horror movie? And I named a movie from 1979 it's not really a horror movie. It's more of a science fiction movie. It was a Soviet-era science fiction movie called Stalker. And some of you may have heard me speak on Stalker before, or heard me or read something I've written about it. But Stalker is a really far out movie because leave it to, this weird world that we live in. I mean, in Soviet society, which at the time was a censorious, strictly materialist society, out comes a movie that, has these great metaphysical insights. In Stalker, in brief, there's this area where an alien ship, it's sort of in the near future, an alien ship had landed and aliens had disembarked, and then the aliens had as quickly as they arrived had left. And so there's this kind of wasteland in central Russia where the aliens had landed, and people sometimes go into this wasteland to try to scavenge alien technology and stuff like that, and the military has sealed it off, and it's called the zone, and the zone is forbidden. And there's this rumor that inside the zone there's this place called the room, and if you can get inside the zone, it's very dangerous, and make it to the room is a place where all your wishes are granted, all your wishes come true. So there's lots of people who are tempted to kind of embark on this dangerous journey into the zone so that they can get to the room and get to the places where their wish comes true. And there are these illegal pirate type figures who guide people into the zone, and they're called stalkers. They're known as stalkers. And so I hope this won't give anything away. This is a bit of a spoiler alert because I'm going to give away something that's in the movie, but it's important and it won't ruin the movie for you. One of the stalkers, one of these illegal guides who bring people inside the zone, before the events of the movie, there was a stalker who committed suicide. And he committed suicide because he went into the zone with his brother with the intention of going to the room, getting their wishes granted. And the zone is a very dangerous landscape. And so his brother was killed before they made it to the room. And so this other stalker, he goes into the room, he comes back out, And suddenly he's incredibly wealthy. And everybody's like, wow, what happened? He got wealthy. But then a week later, he hangs himself. Well, what happened was he came face to face with himself. His brother died as they were trying to sneak into the room, right? And instead of wishing for his brother's revival, instead of saving his brother from death, he got what he really wanted, which was wealth. And that's what The Room does in this movie. This movie is based on a Soviet science fiction novel called Roadside Picnic. The idea is that the aliens just stopped off here on Earth for a little roadside picnic. They left their junk and then they left. But their junk is incredible. It's this miraculous stuff that we don't understand how to use. Kind of like religion, right? Miraculous stuff that we don't understand how to use. Kind of like what I'm describing about the psychical nature of our minds. Miraculous stuff that we understand only in these fragmentary ways. So it can be dangerous too. And so the stalker, this illegal guide, he goes into the zone, he goes into the room, his brother dies, and he gets his wish granted, but the kicker, the nightmare, okay, is that he gets what he really wants. Not what he says he wanted, not what sounds nice, not what makes him look good, but what he really wants. And when he comes face to face with himself, he discovers that what he really wanted is so contrary to his own self-image. I'm a good brother, right? I love people. He was in anguish. He couldn't take it. So I believe that we as seekers really have to know who we are, what we're talking about, what we want, because it seems to me the worst thing is to be strangers to ourselves, to not know, because we internalize a lot of peer pressure and we repeat back what we think we're supposed to want. And, there's a scale of ethics that may be unattainable to us until we have been really frank and blunt with ourselves about what we want. And one of the dangers that we face as seekers, one of the dangers that I face, is we've spent so many years on the path that we think we know ourselves. It's like, I get it, I know what I'm about, And we all think this, we all think this. But my encouragement is to take a really, really, really hard, long look at our self-conception and ask, do I really know? Do I really know? Because in the movie, this stalker, he thinks he knows, who he is and what he's about. But when he's in a position to really get his wishes granted and his wishes come back to him, they're very alienating. They're very, very alienating. It could be that we're experiencing what we want all the time, but we're so alienated from ourselves that we don't recognize it, that, there's this time interval involved in everything. There's always a perception of time. As Neville once put it, we're very forgetful. And, that which we set out to worship or to destroy, comes back to us in some way, and we're entirely forgetful about which is which, which is which, because there's so many conflicting thoughts and possibilities roiling through us. So before we can get to the question in a really meaningful way, of what to do with this perception of self, this greater, more infinite perception of self, we also have to return back to the simplicity of knowing ourselves, of knowing who we really, really are. Because if cleansing the doors of perception, as William Blake put it, results in the individual knowing him or herself for real, knowing yourself in your infinitude, how can we possibly approach infinitude in any way that's useful and constructive, that's real, that gives us access to real ethical questions, if our answers are in any way rehearsed or by rote or by habit? We internalize so much peer pressure, and that peer pressure includes what is good, what is bad, what is generous, what is giving, what is selfish, what is withholding. There's all these questions. My suggestion to you is that we live within our psyche on a continuum of empathy and spite. And I think good versus evil in our psyches, probably have a lot to do with where we fall on that continuum of empathy versus spite. And these are things that we rarely probe. We have very, very clear conceptions of ourselves, but if we believe in the greater psychical truths that I've been trying to articulate, that I've been at least theorizing about, then it behooves us to really know ourselves on a greater scale than we've ever attempted before. Because if, in fact, our psyches are greater than we have been raised to understand, and I think the truth is incontrovertible that they are, then it also places us in front of a greater demand to know who we are, so that we don't wind up availing ourselves of these greater understandings, availing ourselves of these greater powers, but in ways that leave us strangers to ourselves, in ways that leave us alienated from that which we are experiencing. So my deepest wish for everyone in attendance today is that we all succeed in greater and greater ways in cleansing these doors of perception, in seeing reality as it really is, and seeing self as it really is. Because it seems to me that that perception, that awareness, is the turnkey to a greater human sense of self. And my deepest wish is that we as ethical beings, as beings of sensitivity, be up to the qualities and standards demanded by that greater psychical sense of self. So I thank you all very, very much. It's been a pleasure to be able to address you for this brief time this afternoon. And I'd love to open things up, audio permitting, so that we can have some exchange and questions as we round things out. Thank you all again. Thank you.
So if there are folks in the room who have a question, what we're going to do is step up to the microphone here so that Mitch can see you, et cetera, et cetera. If you're on the Zoom, go ahead and click your raise hand button, and Michelle will call on whoever's going to be next in line. I have a question to start with, Mitch. The transparent placebo that you were talking about, presumably the people who are getting the transparent placebo got a sugar pill, and they were told it was a sugar pill, and the control group was giving the same sugar pill but wasn't told.
Oh, the control group received nothing. They were just they were given no treatment. They just said, okay, you're participating in the study, and they were just observed. They received no treatment whatsoever.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Mitch, it's George Metz. How you doing?
Hey, it's been a while. How you doing?
Yeah, good. Hope you get back here next time.
Likewise. Thank you.
I've been doing a lot of research in the last year or two on consciousness, imagination. In some of your books, you talk about the chief aim and your dominant thoughts, and I'm kind of along those same lines. And I'm writing a book right now on spiritual exercises for new thought type oriented people. Just a compilation of exercises that I've had over the years that I tend to use. I was watching an interview the other day with Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, the famous parapsychologist, and he's done some books on how rituals are actually healthy for people's state of well-being. But I'm kind of like you. Other people's rituals are one thing, but the rituals and the exercises that I create for myself seem to be more fulfilling. So I was just kind of, what do you do? What are you doing these days, really, to kind of stay your best, to keep your dominant thoughts headed in the right direction? What kind of spiritual exercises could you probably, give us some tips on today? Thanks.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks, George, and good to see you. Well, I personally, I do think a meditative practice is very important. My own personal choice is transcendental meditation, which is a very relaxing, mantra-based form of meditation. When I'm on schedule, I do it twice a day. I'm not always on schedule, I can assure you. I do engage in my own very radical, self-conceived form of prayer. I think that prayer is very important. I do think that we relate to greater forces or higher powers, and I encourage the individual to be very free-flowing in his or her search for, exactly what that means to you, what higher power or greater force you're seeking a sense of relationship with, wisdom from, petitioning. So that's part of my life. Visualizations, affirmations do continue to be part of my life, particularly when I'm in what could be called the hypnagogic state, which I've spoken about before, and that is that very, very relaxed state that you're in just before drifting off to sleep at night, and just again when you're coming to in the morning. Psychical research has shown that that very relaxed, natural, meditative state is kind of a prime time, so to speak, for psychical activity. There have been experiments in particular involving telepathy, involving one mind sending an image or a message to another mind, where there have been really very statistically significant results when people are placed into a very relaxed state of sensory deprivation. And this is done using a sensory deprivation tank, but it's actually just replicating a state that you naturally go through twice a day, just as you're going to sleep at night and just you're coming to in the morning. So that's a time where prayer, visualization, affirmation is very important to me. I'm also experimenting, and I'm writing about this in the book Daydream Believer. I'm experimenting, quite frankly, with whether the wish in and of itself, has causative properties. And that's something I would encourage you to try. Again, we're traditionally told within New Thought and other practices that entering the feeling state or praying as though you have received, or kind of living from the end, experiencing the arrival of whatever sought, is the kind of turnkey that gets us there. And yet my contention is the wish may be enough in and of itself. It's also important to remember that if one uses Scripture as a antecedent, there's lots of different forms of prayer in Scripture. Cain argues with God. Sarah laughs at, when she's given divine messages. Jonah argues with God. There's these back and forths that are there's many, many different ways, okay, in which prayer is enacted. So we in New Thought tend to internalize the idea that you have to pray as though believing that which you wish for has been received, and I honor that. But I'm saying that you'll find dozens of different examples of prayer, if one uses Scripture as an antecedent. So I'm trying to be very loose and experimenting with different ways and means, including, just whether the wish in and of itself is sufficient.
Thank you. Somebody.
Hi, Mitch. My name is Michelle,
Hi, Michelle.
and it's good to listen to you today.
Thank you.
And I openly admit that I had to kind of surf your words because I could grab the concepts, and I know they integrate, but I can't repeat any of them. But I'm an essence person. I'm not one who grabs details, so that's okay. So what I'm fascinated with, and I have been fascinated with for years, is that I can grab your rationale and your overall perception of all these different things. I'm with you, and I'm Neville lover. And I'm ex-hypnosis person too, so that whole before you go to sleep and wake up your thing, before you wake up in the morning, that's all, or right after you wake up, with all that. What I'm interested in though, if these laws where we create are such, if they are laws in and of themselves, then how is it that we as humans, and of course I have my suspicions, but how do we as humans interrupt the laws so often?
Yeah.
We interrupt them. Like if the law of the creation as you're referring to, and even about the perception, how perception creating the law and calling something into being. Get it, I'm with you. Then how are we so capable of messing it up?
Yeah. That's a wonderful question, and that question burns within me as well. I mean, that's what I was attempting to get at by talking about the fact that we live under so many different, or we experience so many different laws and forces, it seems to me, within this physical framework that we occupy. So let's say a law, in order to be a law, must be consistent. So if we understand that there's a law of mental creativity, then it begs the question that you were putting forward. Well, why did we mess it up so many times? I mean, I'm really burning with that question in my heart as well. One of the things I sometimes say is that gravity is a consistent law. It must be, but we experience gravity radically different on Earth than we do on the planet Jupiter or on the moon. The chemical table, the table of chemical elements, provide us with things that are consistent laws. If you mix certain elements together, you're going to get water. But based upon whether the temperature is lowered or raised to a certain point, that same substance, H2O, sometimes is going to be a vapor, sometimes it's going to be what we call water, it's going to be wet, sometimes is going to be ice, is going to be rock hard. It's the same substance, but it's affected by surrounding circumstances. So I'm asking myself the same question, and I'm frustrated with it, because I want things to be simpler. I want things to be more direct, seen in a certain light. The whole advent of the mind metaphysics movement, going back from, say, in its modern iteration, from the mid 19th century on, in various forms, has been this idea, like, how can we be, kind of like Prometheus? How can we catch fire? How can we steal fire? How can we understand these abilities in a way that's practical and that's real? And then you have, people like Charles and Myrtle Fillmore and Ernest Holmes and Neville and Florence Scovel Shinn, all of whom dedicated their lives, to coming up with methods that would be repeatable, that would allow the individual a protocol to experience these things. And yet, we experience them, but we find, again, between the dreaming and the coming true falls the shadow. Why do we mess it up so much of the time? And I'm frustrated with that same question. You said you had a sense of why, and I'd like to hear that. I mean, maybe you're absolutely correct. So I want to know.
If you're really asking.
I am really asking. I never ask rhetorical questions.
Okay.
I'm against them.
Because of our humanity, right? So everything's energy, right? Since everything's energy, everything's always moving, and we as humans are in form, so we are very slow. We are energy demonstrated in a very physical form, and so there are those physical limitations, my suspicion, and part of that, and we were talking about today in an earlier workshop, the beauty of the human element, and it's the pain and the ego and the suffering and the place where our subconscious retains the memories of that which interrupts the movement of the process. Mm-hmm. And I think that we have not learned how to expel from the subconscious on a consistent basis the memories that are contained within it that stand in the way of allowing for the demonstration that we're seeking to have. I think it is purely the human element, the part that makes us beautiful, and because it's beautiful to feel, it's beautiful to be in pain. It doesn't always feel that way, but it is, and I think that's because we haven't mastered that part of us. That's what I think.
I think that's beautiful. I think that's beautiful insight. I think that's beautifully put. And I would add to that as a supporting observation. My partner Jacqueline Castel, who's a filmmaker, has a wonderful expression that there's a very definite relationship between excellence and pain, between excellence and suffering. There's a lot of people in this world who have created and done extraordinary things, sometimes works of art, sometimes they've built bridges, whatever, as a way of contending with the pathos that they felt within. And it may be, I've made the observation myself that the price of creativity may be friction. We've been experiencing it ever since the metaphorical expulsion from the garden. The price of being human, the price of creativity may be friction. So it may be that there's also a necessary relationship there. But I thank you for sharing that. It's very valuable. Yeah.
Thank you, Michelle. We have time for one more question.
Someone online has a hand raised.
Yes, Jean Sweet had her hand raised. So Jean, if you just unmute yourself and ask Mitch your question.
I want to say hello to everyone, and I'm so grateful to meet you, Mitch, to actually, and the thing that struck me about what you said, oh God, it's such a living thing within me, is the ethical dimension of metaphysics. Mm-hmm. And, American metaphysics was concurrent with the Industrial Revolution. And so as metaphysics became real, became a solid movement and it was an amazing tool of healing. And we began to comprehend the feeling of the wish fulfilled. And then we are moving through, that creating things and the joy of it. And then I'm in this place where it's like, no, look at what we've done. And I feel a huge responsibility. I think, I feel that we bear a huge responsibility for the number of couches there are, for God's sakes. Mm-hmm. Do we need another couch? I don't think so.
Right.
So the ethical dimension is the part where I just am so, it just calls me, drives me right now. Yeah.
No, it's such a heavy question, and I appreciate that enormously. And you're using a good example. Look at couches. Where do these things all go? Well, they go into landfill. Well, this becomes a problem, and we have a lot worse problems than that. But it's a good way of just saying, look, here's one snapshot, onto the issue. And I feel that very, very deeply. I feel that very, very deeply, and I feel this is also why this discussion has been very useful, because I think we need to acknowledge the complexity of problems in our world, and that it's not sufficient just to say, hey, well, everything is the result of kind of one mental super law. I look at the nation of Haiti, for example, where they're having a catastrophic problem with gang violence right now. It's threatening to topple the state. It's threatening to topple the state. Huge problem. And if we were having this conference in the nation of Haiti, we'd have a hugely different set of needs and circumstances that we'd be talking about, and everything would be very different. And you made a valuable observation, which is that American metaphysics, modern American metaphysics, came of age during the Industrial Revolution, which, for all the problems that brought, it also brought a lot of mass prosperity. And so that gave us, certain reference points that we're fortunate enough to live within and to draw upon. But I always try to be mindful of the fact that, the world is filled with a majority of people who don't have my reference points. I turn on the water faucet and I fully expect clean water to come out. Well, that's a privilege. That's a real remarkable thing that a lot of people have built up, for me, across many different generations. And shame on me if I'm not aware of that. Shame on me also if I ever complain, because who am I to complain if I live in a world where I flick a switch and electricity comes out, or I turn on water, the faucet and water comes out? It's like, it puts me in a really poor position, to complain, in that kind of a setting and situation. So I'm with you, and one of the big questions I have is, how do my wishes, if at all, contribute in some real, concrete, actual way to this world where, as you put it, we don't need another couch. We simply don't need another couch. And we need a lot of other things. And I can't be, wishy-washy about it. I mean, these things need to be real. They need to be concrete. Somebody once said, a wise man once said, the only real thing that you can give to another person is time or money. And everybody wants to argue with that and say, well, that's not true, But if you really get down to human needs, that statement, we want to argue with it so badly because it's so true. It's so explicitly true. Thus, we want to push it away, and deny it, But I feel that.
Yeah, and Mitch, one more thing I'd like to say is that, I have impeccable training. Truly, I've had the best teachers, and in all of it, we're trained to want things, not concepts. We're not really trained to want world peace. That's like a lovely idea, but we're not trained to focus our consciousness collectively on concepts like, a quality of life for all sentient life. Mm-hmm. And that's part of my ethical, pathos,
Yeah.
so to speak.
Well, I really appreciate that, and that touches my practice too, because the truth is, I do find myself, to be quite frank, asking a lot of the time, however much I want to perfume it, there's stuff, that I'm asking for, or maybe experiences that I'm asking for. And what you're saying is a very important challenge, and I'm going to live with that as a seeker. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mitch, for being with us, for sharing your insights, giving us lots of fuel for thought, and let us acknowledge him in a beautiful New Thought way. Thank you. Thank you. And we look forward to seeing you in person soon.
Count on it.
Love
Count
and blessings.
Okay, thank you all
Love
very
and blessings.
much. Thank
Bye.
you. See you soon. Bye. Thank you.